morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us again today here in Lethbridge. Well, we're here in Lethbridge, hoping that wherever you are, things are good and summer or spring is in full swing. During this time of social and physical distancing, SACPA believes it's important to keep engaging with the public on issues of the day. And in order to do so, we are very thankful for the continuing support we receive from the University of Lethbridge, Shaw Spotlight, and the Lethbridge Herald. Today, we have Dr. Trevor Harrison from the University of Lethbridge speaking to us on the topic of, after the pandemic, some social, political, and economic impacts. Dr. Trevor Harris is a professor of sociology at the University of Lethbridge and director of Parkland Institute. He was born and raised in Edmonton. He holds a BA from the University of Winnipeg and an MA from the University of Calgary and a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Alberta. His broad areas of specialty include political sociology, political economy, and political policy. In addition to numerous journal articles and book chapters, Dr. Harrison is the author, co-author, and co-editor of 9 books. His op-ed columns frequently appear in both local and national newspapers. Thank you very much for joining us today here virtually, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Annalise. Thank you for the very nice introduction. Let me say it's very nice again to be able to present at SACPA. We all hope at some point in future we can do this again in person. But my talk today very much, of course, centers on the particular situation that we're in right now, where we're doing these kinds of online broadcasts. So what I'm going to do today is look at some of the likely short, medium, and long-term impacts of on society resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, how might that pandemic change our economy, our politics, and society at large? Of these, which changes are likely to be temporary and which are perhaps going to be more permanent? Along the way, I also want to look at possible social policies that we might adopt, changes to labor markets, and also globalization and how that is related to the current pandemic. Some of the things I'm going to talk about, I'm going to be quite often using the word may or possible. And that's because we seem to, at this present time, be kind of floating on a river that has many, many tributaries that we could end up following. Of COVID-19 itself, I'm going to say actually very little. It continues, frankly, to frustrate and to amaze. It presented itself early on as primarily a respiratory ailment, but more recently as one that attacks vital organs. At first, too, it seemed to attack only the elderly, and it remains quite true that age is an important correlate of the severe outcomes, including death, that accompanies it. But there's indications now also, of course, that COVID-19 attacks the very young, but in very different ways, and perhaps, we're not sure yet, with longer health implications. However, my talk today will only deal with the virus itself in passing. So first of all, I want to start off with some broad arguments that I'm going to make here. If we can go to slide number 2. And these arguments, I hope, will kind of frame much that I'm going to be talking about. First, while the virus is a novel one, how we're actually dealing with it is not particularly unique. Distancing and the use of physical or social isolation go back to the Great Plague and was a standard practice, of course, during the Spanish flu epidemic at the end of the First World War. Second, this pandemic may change everything, or it may not. I was reminded as I was preparing for this talk, the somewhat apocryphal story when Ho Chi Minh was asked at one point what happened during the French Revolution, and reportedly he said it was still too soon to tell. The point is, it's actually too soon to tell what the long-term effects are going to be and how many of them are going to be deep or permanent. Third, many of COVID-19's alleged impacts upon the economy and labor markets were, in fact, as I will suggest, things that were already going on. So, one of the effects of the pandemic seems to be mainly to speed up things that were already kind of in the works. Fourth, the pandemic may bring about big government, as some people are talking about, maybe. It may also bring about a retrenchment of, frankly, more authoritarian and bigger corporate state. Pandemics historically have shaken up social and political arrangements that were existing. Experience tells me that those in power do not often want to give up those arrangements very easily. Fifth, globalization has contributed to the pandemic in both direct and indirect ways. But the pandemic also challenges the hubris of individualism and faith in markets spawned by that particular form of globalization, neoliberalism. And it should result in a kind of reconceptualization of what we actually mean by globalization. But again, it may not. We could end up going back to something very similar, or perhaps to some other kind of narrow and insular nationalism, which I think would be equally bad. Sixth, and finally, the pandemic has spawned, I would suggest, in the West particularly, a kind of existential crisis that could, if we pay attention to it, have beneficial value in causing us to rethink who we are, why we do things, the kind of lives that we live, and the values that we hold. But again, it may not. We could instead find people falling back upon fairly futile efforts to return to the past, or in fact, moving towards kind of increased collective or individual violence as we don't come to grips with what the pandemic has actually brought about. So I'm going to turn very quickly here, if we can move to the next slide. I'm going to turn to some statistics. It's hard to talk about this kind of thing without some resort to statistics, and we're certainly deluged with them. We can't ignore the statistics, but the only thing I would suggest is that we also look at the statistics fairly critically. When we're looking at comparisons with other countries, even other regions, some countries are better able and willing to test for COVID-19, so their numbers tend to be also higher, while others simply lack the capacity to gather reliable data. And so that makes comparisons fairly difficult. The most accurate data is always deaths. It's been found generally that accurate death tends to be a fairly accurate variable. You're either dead or you're alive. But other kinds of statistics are a little more problematic. Finally, one of the things I would suggest is that understanding the infection and death rates related to COVID-19 can't be done separate from a whole series of other socio-demographic variables, such not only just age, but gender, education, socioeconomic status, etc., and such environmental factors as overcrowding. So, for example, we know about seniors' homes, but it's also the overcrowding in certain kinds of workplaces. We've seen this around meatpacking plants, prisons, postal stations, and others. So there's a number of critical variables that we need to look at here. Moving on to the next slide, if unemployment, COVID rates seem to be a little bit problematic to look at. Unemployment rates are perhaps even worse. Unemployment rates compared across countries have always been rather problematic, partly because it's the way different countries actually choose to decide who is technically unemployed. But the unemployment figures now are even more difficult to ascertain. As you look down on the list, one good example here is, in fact, Canada. And so recent unemployment figures for May suggested that our unemployment figure is at 13%, which would certainly be very high. But some economists, including Jim Stanford, has suggested that in fact the figure might be closer to 30%. And that would actually bring us into the range of the Great Depression. Now, fortunately, we have much better social programs than we had back then. But still, this is an alarming rate of unemployment or underemployment that we're dealing with at this point. So, just following on that, I want to also look at more broadly some of the notes on the economic impact. If we can turn to the next slide here. Economists have actually had a very difficult time in actually thinking about what is the impact of the pandemic. Economic writers in general have had a difficulty in ascertaining what will be even the short or the medium term impacts of this. Some examples here I'll give you. On March 11th, USA Today predicted the economic fallout from the pandemic would be not nearly as bad as 2008. It would be brief but not deep. Gwynne Dyer, writing on March 28th, I'm quoting from him here, said, "There will be a recession, of course, but it probably won't be as bad or as long as the one after the financial crash of 2008. More accurately, as it turns out, the Financial Post, in those intervening period there on March 14th, said the pandemic's impact would be worse, brought on by fear, and again, in its words, the financial crisis of 2008 did not come with a mortality rate. What's really interesting about each of these quotes here is that they're using as a comparison 2008, the Great Recession. And I'll talk about that a little bit, how they 2008 and today is similar in some ways, but also very different. So the early predictions for the results of the pandemic were that we would have a kind of V-shaped recovery. That is a fast decline followed by a relatively swift rebound of the economy again. More recently, some of the predictions are that the rebound is going to be more prolonged and actually kind of bumpy on the way. So we might see 2 steps forwards and 1 step back again. And it might also vary from country to country. Comparing the 2008 with today, in 2008, people and banks went bankrupt as bad loans based on easy credit were called in. The crisis in 2008 was one of liquidity. The banking system had seized up, resulting in economic activity coming to a standstill. Like today, unemployment soared. Beyond this, however, the comparison between 2008 and today falters a little bit. Today, the problem is only secondarily one of demand. Yes, many people have lost their jobs, and government in the tried and true ways are finding ways to get money into people's hands. But the initial cause of the economic crisis was a health crisis compounded by fear. If people are afraid to go into a shop to buy, it makes perfect sense from the point of view of business owners to lay off workers. But the unemployment and declining GDP are knockdown impacts of the health crisis. Since the time of Keynes, recessions have been dealt with through fiscal stimulus, building bridges, roads, schools, etc. In short, kind of public works, and social programs such as unemployment insurance. These actions get money into consumers' hands directly. Again, there's nothing really wrong with these kinds of programs and policies that are being implemented at this time. So public works programs, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, however, are unlikely to solve this particular problem, in part because today's economy revolves primarily around service sector jobs. 70% or more of labor market employment involves services such as, for example, sales and food and beverages. The issue is how to reinflate the economy when jobs are disappearing due to fear of people associating with each other. An important element, excuse me, an important element of this problem is that much low-end service work is done, in fact, by women. And it is women particularly who have been most negatively impacted by the economic shutdown. Additionally, women also tend to be the majority, the majority of household spending. In this context, typical bricks and mortar stimulus programs, again, building bridges, will benefit some male workers, but not restart the economy as a whole. It's taking this into consideration is the reason why economist Armin Yelnitsyn has referred to this actually as a she session, because it is centered really around the loss of jobs among women and the decline of that particular economy, which is dependent upon people actually engaging with each other in a face-to-face manner. Governments have begun opening up the economy, but what does this mean in practical terms for small businesses? Business owner can open his or her door, but what if no one comes in to buy? This is what I would call the field of nightmares scenario. What if we reopen it and nobody comes? The problem again is not a lack of demand as in 2008. The problem is an excess of fear that might be compounded if the economy opens up too soon. Some health historians and epidemiologists are predicting a second wave of infections, likely in the fall, based on past experiences of other pandemics. What if this happens? Imagine the heightened impact on the economy if a second shutdown is ordered. Even worse, imagine the impact on the psychology of consumers if the pandemic returns stronger than ever. Answering these questions requires us to think again about the causes of the economic problem itself. It's a health issue. As suggested in a recent Maclean's article by Amir Ataran of the University of Ottawa, in order to resuscitate the economy, governments have to tackle every outbreak of COVID-19 quickly and completely and efficiently. In Alberta, for example, had the seniors' homes and the meatpacking plants been shut down immediately, the numbers of cases in the province would have been minuscule. Consider the number of cases that are actually related to a few meatpacking plants and a few seniors' homes. Take those out of the equation, and our numbers would be actually fairly low, but we didn't respond quickly enough. Community spread, had it been dealt with, would have been halted, and many of the fears that people have to engage in the economy also would have been dealt with. If I can move then to the next slide, and a few comments then about which particular sectors and businesses are likely to be impacted, and the effect on the labor market generally. There are going to be some medium-term and long-term impacts. Again, some of these are not totally well known yet, and we'll see how they play out in the next while. I do think that some very large, heavily capitalized firms are going to actually come out of this reasonably well. The reason is they can, of course, they have the financial resources to be able to sustain themselves throughout. They will also be able to probably gobble up some of their smaller competitors and make themselves stronger. In some ways, this is very similar to, again, 2008, where some of the very big players came out actually reasonably well. But some small and medium-sized companies are for sure going to not survive and will, in fact, as we've already seen, go bankrupt. In the medium term, I think airlines, some high-end fashion houses, which require really people to come in as opposed to buying online, are going to have a difficult time. Restaurant services for sure are going to, in the medium term at least, suffer. Car manufacturing and sales, because people are not traveling around. Professional sports and entertainment, the very fact that we have a limited number of people who can get together is a serious impact. We see this in terms of professional leagues trying to figure out how they're going to continue having seasons, or in the NHL's case, complete the season in empty arenas effectively. And for some leagues, for example, like the CFL, this is going to be very difficult because they rely on bums in the seats, as they say, as opposed to TV sales. universities and colleges, anything to do with shipping is also likely to suffer, at least in the medium term. Um, but some businesses are actually seem to be doing reasonably well. Online sales for gym equipment, home theaters seem to be doing really well. People can't go out to actual theaters, so they're buying equipment like crazy. My prediction is that much of that gym equipment that will be bought in the next little while, in another a few months or another year, will be for sale at garage sales everywhere as people decide they didn't actually use it anyway. Um, Long term, I think there's going to be some businesses that are going to really suffer. I think that Airbnb, given the lack of travel and tourism, is going to be a problem. Cruise ships, again, though, are something that was already in trouble for a number of reasons. And I think we could see a lot of very large cruise ships probably be melted down into scrap again, because I think that's an industry that is not going to have a great future. Real estate. Real estate holdings are going to have a tough time because some businesses, at least, are going to move much more to online and at home work. Although I don't want to emphasize this, I think that there will be some businesses that will people will work at home, but that there will be a kind of hybrid that people will still get together in person because people are essentially social animals. Uh, there will be a number of things that will be subjected to more automation. Again, this was happening in a lot of places. Any kind of repetitive work that machines can do better and more efficiently and cheaper is going to be increasing. Uh, Concern here certainly around such things as healthcare and education. We see already the move to kind of online teaching at universities, but also kind of online phone your doctor kind of things through the Babylon program that's working with TELUS. These were things that were already in the works, but I think there's a possibility this will be accentuated during this crisis. So, what are some things that we could look at in terms of possible policy changes? Moving to the next slide here. I've put a question mark at the end of all these because I think they're things to think about and question whether they could come. Some of them I think would be beneficial. Much talk about seniors' homes and the problem of overcrowding there, also compounded by the fact that, quite frankly, most of them are privately run and the wages and benefits are very poor, which makes it very difficult to have people work there. I would suggest, though, that besides looking at large institutional seniors' homes, we should be actually looking at a revitalization of home care, which probably in the long run would be cheaper and maybe even better for the people who are elderly, until such time as, of course, they require some other kind of care. So that would be something to look at. Um, Social infrastructure, many people have talked about universal public daycare. As I've said, one of the issues here is that trying to get women back into the workforce, it's very difficult to go into the workforce where women, as it is, tend to work a double day with kids, with family, and then trying to also work in a paid employment. Public daycare would be the kind of stimulus that might assist in reinflating the economy. Um, will mass transit take a hit? I raise this as a just a possibility. We've been trying to get more and more people to go on public transit, but we've also now in the pandemic been telling people to social distance, and people are afraid of being in crowds. What will be the effect of mass transit? And at the same time, for very good economic and environmental reasons, we're trying to move to more public transit. So I raise it as a question again: how will that be impacted? A raise in minimum wage. It's interesting, I think, that 1 year ago, some people were complaining about a raise of minimum wage to people at $15 an hour. Many of those same people now working for minimum wage have been proven to be the real heroes of this crisis, working at jobs that are sometimes extremely dangerous, but also really keeping many of us alive and functioning. And I think they do deserve to be rewarded better than they have been. A general redistribution of profits to workers as a whole. The gap between rich and poor has got enormous over this last several decades. Are we going to look at a redistribution of profits? A revamped social safety net. Some people are talking about a guaranteed annual income. In some ways, the money that has been given out by the government to people to during this period has been used as or viewed as maybe a kind of model for what could happen. Greater worker protections, greater safety in the workplace, and perhaps most importantly, whistleblowing legislation that's really effective. In many of these places, including seniors' homes and the meatpacking plants, had workers who were actually afraid to lose their jobs, had the protections to speak out about what they saw going on in these workplaces. We actually could have headed off much of these crises. But so giving the protections of workers to be able to speak freely about what they're seeing in the workplace would probably be a really good economic and social move as well. More and better public housing. Pandemics tend to thrive in places where you have lousy housing, if you have housing at all, and where overcrowding occurs. Expanded healthcare coverage. Again, we want to take care of everybody because the health of the sickest in our society is also a protection for everybody else. And public ownership of certain key industries. We need greater security of food, for example. Are we looking at going back to something like the kind of protections that the wheat board used to offer people? A little bit about deficits and debt here. I know this is a concern. Moving on to the next slide. There's been a number of comments about this. The only thing I can say is certainly debt is a concern. But we have to keep in mind that we had a much larger debt at the end of the Second World War, to 109% of GDP, and we worked our way out of that actually fairly quickly. So we can grow out of it. That's a possibility. We may rebound. We could raise revenues. And of course, some people are talking about cutting expenditures. Problem with that is, as during any recession, if you start to cut expenditures, you're actually cutting demand again, and you're doubling up on the recession. So, what I would suggest is we think more globally, though. We don't think just in terms of Alberta. We don't just think in terms of Canada. We think globally because it's a pandemic, and to deal with it, we need to think globally. But then to pay for the cost of this, we also need to think globally. So such things as debt forgiveness for third world countries, perhaps a debt jubilee where all debts are wiped out altogether, Tobin taxes on the capital transfers, for sure a crackdown on tax evasion, much of which is actually engaged with criminal activity. And as Mark Cuban, the owner of Phoenix Suns, said, a trickle-up economics where you get money into people at the bottom end who are deserving, and then they have it to spend in the economy. A couple of quick comments about neoliberal globalization and how it's impacted the pandemic. One is that neoliberal globalization contributed to inequalities. And starving populations, for example, have been pushed to the brink in many places where they're looking for new food sources. So when you think about those wet markets, these are people who are basically really hungry, looking for other foodstuffs. And so what's happened is the species barrier was jumped, partly because of the of problems of food scarcity. Poor, underdeveloped countries tend to also have very poor healthcare systems. Again, pandemics thrive in places where you have poor healthcare. It's also because of globalization, it's much more difficult to isolate diseases when they get going in one region of the world. What a fascinating article. I've left some references up on on these PowerPoints for people if they want to look afterwards. Avishai, who is a author of the idea of the black swan, has said that there's too much connectivity in the world, actually. and that it is the tail ends, the kind of things that are not expected, but they're the ones that actually come back to bite us. And so he actually suggests we need to have a little less connectivity as part of globalization. So what else should we, one other final thing I'll just mention here is globalization has actually been based on the idea of just-in-time production. So when people talk about why didn't we have enough masks or other supplies necessary for this, this is actually built into neoliberal globalization. It's the idea that we don't produce anything until we absolutely need it. So we have not built up the kinds of redundancy in our systems, having enough beds, enough masks, enough other supplies to deal with crises when they come along. There's been a number of ideas about what needs to be done in terms of globalization. Will we get rid of globalization altogether? What I'm suggesting actually is I think we need a new kind of globalization that is not a neoliberal profit-driven idea of globalization, but one that actually is concerned about people all around the world, and most especially those people in the poorest regions, because if we don't, as Homer Dixon has said, this is where the next pandemic is going to be incubated and will again start to spread around the world. Finally, in the last piece I'm going to talk about here, the last slide on kind of an existential crisis. And a wonderful quote here from Harari in the Guardian Weekly recently. The modern world has been shaped by the belief that humans can outsmart and defeat death. That was a revolutionary new attitude. For most of history, humans meekly submitted to death. The most important events of human existence happened after you exhaled your last breath. And I think it is telling actually that much of the panic about the pandemic is happening in the Western modern world, where we have believed that we will be forever young, forever healthy, that death is something that is not just part of the natural course of life, but in fact, we're going to continue in a kind of fairy tale world. And so I think there is a kind of existential crisis that the pandemic has brought about that a lot of people in the West are actually wrestling with right now. And how we wrestle with that, how we come to terms with the inevitability of mortality, is going to say a great deal about how we think about the kind of society that we have and that we want in future. So with that, I want to thank everybody for your attendance here virtually. Again, I've left some references up here on the next slide. And welcome to any questions that people I'm sure will have at this point. Thank you again.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Trevor, for this very engaging subject and topic, and for speaking with us. We've got quite a few questions already in the queue, so I'm going to jump right in and read them out for you. Knut Peterson starts off with a question. Common understanding is that all loans have to be repaid over time. Does that actually hold true when governments print money to stimulate the economy?
What a great question. Right now, so governments are providing money to a lot of businesses and individuals as loans. At some point, of course, if people can't pay for it, you have to decide, is it worthwhile to just simply write them off? And for example, that's why I'm suggesting in terms of third world countries, there's some loans that are just so beggaring that there's no way they could ever possibly pay them off. So it's actually to our advantage at some point to just simply take the loss. Uh, Governments themselves are in an interesting position right now. Technically, although we have instances of governments going bankrupt, it doesn't happen very often, and it's highly unlikely that Canada would, for example. Governments can actually borrow at incredibly low interest rates. So the one real benefit right now is, although we do have a rising deficit level and of course debts, um, if we can grow out of it, and that's the big if, this is a good time to actually borrow on all kinds of infrastructure things, but also putting money into people's hands so that, again, they have that money to spend when we come out of the pandemic. But again, as I said in my talk, we need to think of this first and foremost as a health issue and not as a economic issue per se. The economic issue is a knockdown effect of the health issue itself.
Okay, our next question comes from Trevor Page. Paint a picture of where you see Lethbridge and southern Alberta 5 years down the road, both economically and the social fallout.
Mm. Well, you're asking me to predict. I'm glad I'm not going to be putting any money on this. Uh, I do worry about how governments will actually deal with this crisis. I think how we deal with it is going to be the telling point here. I said you can grow your way out of the economic problems that are going to be the fallout of this. The pandemic will end. We will get out of the health crisis. How we deal with the rest of it is the big issue. We could grow out of it. We could think of the opportunity here to invest and grow the economy. We certainly, and I've argued this in the past, I won't go at it at length, but I do think we have a serious revenue problem here. Just quick figure, Alberta undertaxes next to the next highest taxing province in Canada to the tune of $14.5 billion a year. We don't have a problem of spending. We have a problem. We just don't bring in enough money to pay for everything that people want. So my concern here is that the current government is very likely then to go to the third way of dealing with deficits and debts, which is more privatization of, we see today Parkland, privatization of healthcare, privatization of colleges and universities, selling off of assets and still not raising the revenues that are necessary. So if that happens, actually, I think Southern Alberta and Alberta as a whole, our future is not going to be very good. I would see actually that we'll be in a state of perpetual recession and that very likely a lot of people will actually start to just move out of the province. That would be the best and the brightest will leave Alberta if those last measures are taken into effect.
Okay. Ellen Carter, these are all important social initiatives to create a more just society. Do you have suggestions on how to move our current provincial government in the needed direction?
Well, as we're, governments are actually responsive more than we sometimes realize to public pressure. Some governments tend to have, be a bit more ideological and more focused on what they believe is the right answer. But most governments do tend to react to public pressure, as we're seeing actually right now south of the border in regards to a different issue going on. So yeah, I think marshal good arguments, have good evidence-based arguments for why one thinks this is a better policy, and show not just that it's a better policy, but how it actually will make society better as a whole. So I think having the evidence for these things is an important thing, and then going out there and actually speaking to everybody, not just politicians, but friends, neighbors, and everyone you know about here is a better way to actually deal with things, and hopefully we'll get there.
Okay, our next two questions are from Eloise Thierren from Global Lethbridge. I'm trying to localize the impacts. What sectors in Lethbridge and southern Alberta will be the hardest hit?
Yeah, I think depending on how the government actually deals with it, certainly I think health and education. Health and education are the biggest employers in all of certainly Lethbridge area. A huge number of, and I'm not just talking about the college or the university, but of course K to 12 as well, and the healthcare sectors. There's a lot of jobs impacted there, depending on how the government deals with things. The pandemic itself could affect certainly food production. We've seen that in southern Alberta in terms of the meat packing plants. Many of these will probably bounce back. So as I've said, there's kind of short, medium, and long-term impacts. Tourism. In most places around the world, and certainly in Alberta, tourism is actually one of the biggest industries. If people are no longer traveling across, not just from outside of Canada, but and coming here, but traveling across the country to visit the many wonderful things we have in southern Alberta, then that could certainly be a real impact. Uh, Again, the service industries, restaurants. You can open up your restaurant, and operating a restaurant is works on very tight margins. The profits are not great there, so it's highly competitive. And if on top of that, people don't start to return to restaurants in any numbers, and at the same time, you're also having to restructure your restaurant so that people are sitting, 2 meters apart. These are all costs at the same time as the money is actually not coming in there. So, food services, tourism, health, education, I think these are major areas that could be impacted. Whether or not it's going to be the short, the medium, or the long term remains again one of those questions.
Okay, and Eloise's second question, you mentioned needing to think globally. What, if anything, can be done locally to make a change? Can the city of Lethbridge and its citizens do anything?
Yeah, I think we need to educate ourselves about what some of these issues are. So, I'll give you kind of a counter example of this. So, we've unfortunately seen in the course of this pandemic some frankly racist incidents where people have turned against people, particularly from China, or people they perceive as being from China, as they're the cause of this pandemic, right? And so I think the counter of that, the positive counter to that, is to educate ourselves about why is it that pandemics are spreading up like this. This particular one, COVID-19, is different from other pandemics, but it bears some similarity with HIV, with SARS, with MERS. These are all pandemics that are actually caused by the jumping across species of diseases that previously would not have been jumping. And so for us to understand, even if minimally, and I'm not a epidemiologist, but us to understand even minimally the way that how we have structured our economy, the way we trade, the way we travel, the way that we have pushed marginalized populations into parts of the world where they, as I said, are eating essentially things that are not regular foodstuffs, but they're hungry. And so we've created a condition in which these cross species pandemics are actually coming about. So locally, I think we can educate ourselves about what we have done as a global species, a super species, to bring these things about ourselves. And then in turn, also to educate ourselves about what we need to do to take care of those people in underdeveloped countries who have, in many cases, suffered the brunt of the worst kind of globalization that we could have brought about.
Okay, and our next question comes from Laurie Schultz. To what extent will COVID 19 lead to a revaluing of workers and jobs in service sector and caregiving of seniors, children, as well as in retail? Or will this just fade?
Yeah, and again, I've said may and maybe not throughout much of this talk. I'm thinking back to again 2008. In some ways, is not the worst comparison in the world. Everybody said after the Great Recession, well, this does change everything, and in fact, not very much changed at all. The biggest companies, the financial houses that had brought about the crisis, ended up making money out of it, and so we just kept going on our merry way. So I hear lots of nice platitudes right now about we should be doing this and we're valuing all these workers, and isn't terrible about the low pay and lousy conditions of people working in seniors homes, or we need to take care of the lowliest waged people. I hope we stick with that and actually, besides giving lip service, actually do something about it. We do need to recompense people at the low end because they do great work. They do important work, as we're discovering throughout this. And even in the most uh, mercenary kind of economic sense, the fact is the economy shuts down if you don't keep enough money in people's hands to actually buy goods. And so these people, everybody who's working at some minimal wage job right now needs better benefits, higher wages, better worker protection, because they really are in the front lines. And I hope we remember that. I hope governments particularly remember that. But on the other hand, I fear that 6 months after this is over, we'll go back to the way it was again. So let's try not to let that happen.
Okay. Um, Richard Muller says, thank you, Trevor. Colin Quintel, not only is growing debt a concern, but what about the loss of taxation revenues from all levels of government? How will this affect government's ability to maintain public services going forward?
Yeah, that certainly is a problem. On the one hand, you can't get money from a stone, so as businesses go bankrupt, it's hard to tax them. On the other hand, there are going to be some businesses out there who are doing extremely well. A lot of online businesses are doing really well. So we have to find the money someplace. I did mention the level of federal debt, but of course we have provincial debts, and we've had a rising level of personal debts over time. And we need to think critically about how we actually are going to pay for those things. So we should be going after where the money actually still is to pay for these things. One of the parts of a slide I didn't go over at any length is, again, thinking globally. Uh, Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, is apparently going to become the world's first trillionaire. I used to keep statistics years ago about just millionaires, and then it went to billionaires. Now we're talking about trillionaires. There is actually a lot of money out there, and it seems to me governments actually globally need to start thinking about how they're going to get that to pay off these debts that are going to be accumulated not just in Canada but elsewhere. So, but it is a problem. At some point, we do need to either find the new pockets of money. Remember, Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, was once asked, "Why do you rob banks, Willie?" He said, "Because that's where the money is." Well, you need to go find where the actual money is and start to get hold of that. But again, in some cases, we're just simply going to have to write off many of these debts because there's no way that the people involved in it are going to be able to pay for these things. But it is a legitimate concern. Again, we could possibly grow out of it. Lots of people are hoping for that, and we've had instances of that in the past. So it's like amortizing the mortgage you have on house. So how long do you want to push it out in future? But then we have some countries, a few over the years, who have gone bankrupt, and that's Canada's far, far from that. But we want to be concerned about it.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions left and about 10 minutes in, or 10 minutes left, but yeah.
I'll try to be very
Okay.
brief.
We've got Cameron from the Prentice Institute says, congratulations on a very timely presentation and thank you, Sakpa. Then we have Leona Jacobs. Anti-racism protests of the past have faded, as well as school shootings, as the news cycle moves on. Has the pandemic informed the global response to the current anti-racism protests? And if so, how?
Good question. The first point, I think it is, as I said, I think we have short memories. So it's interesting right now. In fact, of course, the race issues in the States have now wiped out talk about the pandemic down there. So we do tend to have pretty short memories and news cycles. Uh, if the pandemic, to the extent it's actually impacted uh, the race crisis is, and the discussion that's going on, not just in the States, but I think an important one in Canada and locally. If it has affected it, I think it's done it in a kind of indirect way. I think certainly there is a greater awareness of issues of, once again, of inequality, and how certain groups have been particularly negatively affected. I mean, one of the things we actually see, and I mentioned this about talking about the effects of the pandemic, we can't separate that from such issues as socioeconomic status, certainly race, ethnicity. So, negative health outcomes impact certain populations more than others. We sort of knew that, but I think during this crisis, it's been brought home even more again. And so I think there's both a direct and an indirect uh, relationship between the two things going on right now. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And our next question is from Laurie Schultz. Will a movement to purchasing food from farmers growers locally and directly and purchasing day-to-day staples from more local or regional sources reinvigorate local, provincial, and Canadian economies?
It could. I think that I said about some of the negative effects of neoliberal globalization, and part of that was the idea that comparative advantage, so certain areas should specialize in this and others should forget about. Well, even back to 1988, when we were talking about free trade in this country, a lot of people, critics at the time, said, well, why would you make yourself so dependent for important goods from some other place? And food is an obvious thing. So during this pandemic, there's been a lot of concern about food security and, of course, insecurity. There's a possibility here that we will see a growth in, and I think we are seeing a growth in local markets. Part of that is also connected to the fact that transportation systems are also have been affected by the pandemic. Will this be short term or will this be long term again, so that large food producers once again take over those markets and little local markets are driven out? We'll see, but there is certainly, I think, some consensus that in places like Canada, we need to have greater control over food as a vital issue of security for the population.
Okay, and our next question comes from Bev Mundell. We've seen the reliance on external suppliers is problematic. Will our governments use this time as the opportunity to create more Canadian industry to be more self-reliant, i.e. build our own e-cars?
Yeah, again, it's much the same issue as what I've said for some time now. I think when we think about globalization, we need to think about what things can be globalized and should be, and what things can't be or shouldn't be globalized. And this whole issue again has raised issues around security. And so you had the absurdity of where some of the wood product that went into making face masks was actually being shipped down to the United States, where then the masks were being built. And then President Trump said, well, he was going to stop the shipment of those same masks back to Canada, even though Canada actually had the raw material to produce the goods. I think, unfortunately, so many governments over the last 35, 40 years have been so entranced with the idea of free trade and open borders. Remember, we used to talk about a borderless world, that they've forgotten their first role of government really is to protect their own citizens. And so there are certain kinds of things I don't think should be totally globalized. And we do need to think more in terms of how do you protect the Canadian public. So it's not just food supplies, but for example, medicines. We should have our own labs producing, the necessary medicines that for our population. And we should be thinking also in terms of stockpiling necessary resources. So again, we aren't working in a kind of just-in-time production cycle where if we need it, we produce it right now, because that's not preparing for, as Avishai says, the the possibility of the worst kind of thing happening, right? You need to think in terms of what could happen and how to protect yourself in those instances. So,
Eloise from the Global News, thanks you for answering your questions and for a great presentation. Leona Jacobs, what has, and then in brackets, potentially fingers crossed, changed for the better as a result of this pandemic?
yeah, what things have changed for the better? I think there's a change of, certainly a change of consciousness. I think a lot of people are much more aware, for example, of the issues of seniors' homes. Now, people who have actually been studying this, the experts in the field, and people who have had their parents in seniors' homes have known about these things, but until it's actually brought to the forefront, a lot of people don't. We live our lives in kind of a insulated cocoon, and we don't think about these things. So I think that's one thing. Meatpacking plants again. I think there's a lot of people that you go to the local store, you buy your meat, you don't think about how it's produced, the whole process, the workers who are working there, what their lives are like. So I think there is a growing awareness of that has broken kind of the insulated bubble that a lot of us live in. And again, I think there's been during this period of time a kind of slowing down of the pace of life so that some people have had the chance to think more about who they are, what they do, and how is it necessary the way we lived our lives before. Now, will 6 months from now people go back to the way they lived again? Will they forget about meat packing plants? Will they forget about, seniors' homes, whatever? Possibly. But on the other hand, maybe this will have that kind of transformative effect. So if it does, I think we can say this was one of the beneficiaries of this. And there have been actually a number of articles written. There's been a lot of great stuff written during this time where people have said there are some positives to come out of this. So we may hope.
Our next question comes from Laurie Schultz. Just in time philosophy, and then in brackets the lean methods, has been applied to providing human services, i.e., bathing on a senior within so many minutes in the LTC. What are your thoughts on whether local, provincial, Canadian governments will move away from the just-in-time philosophy?
I would hope that governments would, but in order to do that, they actually have to move away from a much too cozy relationship with the corporate sector, with the very big players who run much of our economy. And for a lot of businesses, just in time, at least initially, seems to make some sense because they keep their costs down. And this means they can raise their share prices. They can reward their investors, and it looks good on your books in the short term. Now, if you were a really wise and smart business leader, you might think long term, but a lot of our businesses don't. And so, governments, should they actually want to, in fact, even protect the businesses themselves, sometimes need to protect businesses from themselves. And that means actually taking steps that business owners might not agree with immediately, but it might be in the best in the long run. And so breaking away from this kind of idea of just in time. The other thing is that, quite frankly, just in time production would not be something that a lot of unions and union leaders and workers themselves would like. It's actually really onerous. It's doesn't make for a nice workplace. And so if you want to break away from that, it's not just a role of government, but it seems to me that you need to empower unionized workers and the people working in these sites to be able to say, we want more control over the work process and not just simply be treated as wage slaves.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Knut Peterson. Jason Kenney is the only premier in Canada that hasn't seen a dump in popularity during COVID-19. What does that tell you about Albertans?
Yeah, it's certainly those polls are really interesting. I think a lot of people have said, and I would tend to agree that there seem so the pandemic is going on the one hand, and the government can take some credit for it not getting totally out of control here. And then, as I said, had they actually stepped into the meatpacking plants and some seniors' home, they could have kept the numbers down even lower. I think the reason that Jason Kenney's own rankings and maybe the governments have been sliding is just simply what's been going on the left hand at the same time as the right hand is doing something. So the fights with the doctors, clearly in the midst of a pandemic, much publicized, seems to be really given them a hit. There's also on the outskirts of this, the fight with the doctors, the fact that the government has continued basically to say that when this pandemic's over with, yes, we loved all you nurses and everything you're doing in these places, but we're also going to come after you and we're going to cripple you financially after this. So I think all those things for a lot of Albertans, not just people in the health field, are saying, well, what's going on here? This seems to be kind of a weird contradictory stance. So I think that probably explains it.
Okay, we have our final question here from Bev Mundell. With the clearing of skies over many smoke-clogged cities, will we see less car use?
I don't think the clearing of the skies is just simply a temporary phenomenon. Of course, that's also tied to airplane travel, which has obviously been curtailed by about 95%, from my understanding. There's a lot of talk about maybe this shows us the way to the future. Uh, the environmental issues are a separate issue in some sense. I mean, they are deeply connected with this. But if we're going to think about recreating a new kind of world out there, clearly the environmental piece has to be dealt with. I said this is COVID-19 was treated first and foremost as a respiratory illness. To the extent it is, clearly having very bad air is going to contribute to that. And we see that right around the world. So that's why I think governments are more sensitive to that. As an offshoot of it, of course, there's lots of talk about electric cars. So it's possible that we will see a move in that direction. But the two things I think are connected, but also slightly indirectly connected.
Okay, and that's our session for today. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Next week, we have Dr. Michael Unger talking about the resilience during a pandemic. That's coming up on Thursday next week at 10 o'clock. And then on Friday next week, we have Desmond Cole addressing Black Lives Matter. So we hope that you'll join in for those two presentations. And thank you so much, Trevor, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And I'm going to go offline now.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.